Riveted, Chris did not hear the doorbell chime, did not hear Sharon stop typing and go to the door. The demoniacal form of possession is usually thought to have had its origin in early Christianity, yet in fact both possession and exorcism predate the time of Christ. The ancient Egyptians as well as the earliest civilizations of the Tigris and the Euphrates believed that physical and spiritual disorders were caused by invasion of the body by demons. The following, for example, is the formula for exorcism against maladies of children in ancient Egypt. Go hence, thou who comest in darkness, whose nose is turned backwards, whose face is upside down. Hast thou come to kiss this child? I will not let thee. Chris? Shah, I'm busy. There's a homicide detective wants to see you. Oh, Christ, Sharon. Tell him to. Abruptly Chris stopped, then looked up and said, oh. Yeah, sure, Sharon. Tell him to come in. Let him in. Sharon left and Chris stared at the pages of the book, unseeing, gripped by some formless yet gathering premonition of dread. Sound of a door being closed. Sound of walking this way. A sense of waiting. Waiting? For what? Like the vivid dream one can never remember, Chris felt an expectancy that seemed known and yet undefined. His hat brim crumpled in his hands. He came in with Sharon, wheezing and listing and deferential. I am really so sorry, Kinderman said as he approached. Yes, you're busy. I can see that. I'm a bother. How's the world? Chris asked him. Very bad. And how's your daughter? No change. I'm so sorry. Breathing adenoidally, Kinderman was standing by the table now, his drooping beagle eyes moist with concern. Look. I wouldn't even bother. I mean, your daughter. It's a worry. God knows. When my little girl Julie was down with the... What, now? What was it? Can't remember. It. Why don't you sit down? Chris cut in. Oh, yes, thank you very much. The detective exhaled gratefully while settling his bulk in a chair across from Sharon, who, seemingly oblivious, continued to type. Sorry? You were saying? Chris asked. Well, my daughter, she... Oh, well, no. Never mind. I get started. I'll be telling you my whole life story. You could maybe make a film of it. No, really. It's incredible. If you only knew half the crazy things that used to happen in my family, you would. No. No. Never mind. All right, one. I'll tell one. Like my mother, every Friday she would make for us gefilte fish, all right? Only all week long, the whole week. No one gets to take a bath on account of my mother has the carp in the bathtub. It's swimming back and forth, because my mother said this cleaned out the poison in its system. I mean, really, who knew? Who knew that carp the whole time are all thinking all these horrible and evil, vindictive thoughts? Oh, well, enough now. Really. Only now and then a laugh just to keep us from crying. Chris studied him. Waiting. Ah, you were reading. The detective was looking down at the book on witchcraft. For a film? No, just passing the time. Is it good? I just started it. Witchcraft, Kinderman murmured, his head angled to the side as he read the book's title at the top of a page. So okay now, what's doin'? Chris asked. Yes, I'm sorry. You're busy. I'll finish. As I said, I wouldn't bother you, except... Except what? Looking suddenly grave, the detective clasped his hands together on the polished pine tabletop. Well, it seems that Burke... Damn it! Snapped Sharon irritably as she ripped out a letter from the platen of the typewriter, crumpled it up in her hands and then errantly tossed it at a waste paper basket close to Kinderman's feet. He and Chris had turned their heads to stare at her, and when the secretary saw them, she said, Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't even know you were there. You're Miss Fenster? Asked Kinderman. Spencer, Sharon corrected him as she slid her chair back and got up to retrieve the balled-up letter from the floor with a murmured, I never said I was Julius Irving. Never mind, the detective told her as, reaching to the floor near his foot, he picked up the crumpled page. Oh, thanks. Sharon stopped and went back to her chair. Excuse me, you're the secretary? Kinderman asked her. Sharon, this is... Chris turned to Kinderman. Sorry, she said to him. Your name again? Kinderman. William F. Kinderman. This is Sharon, Sharon Spencer. With a courtly tilt and nod of the head, the detective told Sharon, it's a pleasure. Sharon was now bent forward, eyeing him curiously, her chin resting on folded arms atop the typewriter. And perhaps you can help me, the detective added. Her arms still folded, Sharon sat up and said, "Me? Yes, perhaps. On the night of Mr. Dennings's demise, you went out to a drugstore and left him alone in the house, am I correct?" "Well, not exactly. Regan was here." "That's my daughter," Chris clarified. "Spelling?" "Regan," Chris told him. "Lovely name," said Kinderman. "Thank you." The detective turned back to Sharon. Now Dennings had come here that night to see Mrs. MacNeil. "Yes, that's right." "He expected her shortly?" "Yes, I told him I expected her back pretty soon." "Very good. And you left at what time? You remember?" "Let's see. I was watching the news, so I guess. Oh, no. Wait. Yes, that's right. I remember being bothered because the pharmacist said the delivery boy had gone home and I said, 'Oh, come on now,' or something about it only being about 6:30. Then Bert came along just 10, maybe 20 minutes after that. So a median," concluded the detective, "would have put him here at 6:45. Not so? And so what's this all about?" Chris asked him. The nebulous tension she'd been feeling had mounted. "Well, it raises a question, Mrs. MacNeil. To arrive at the house at, say, 6:45 and leave only 20 minutes later." Chris shrugged. "Oh, well, that was Burke," she said. "Just like him." "Was it also like him," Kinderman asked, "to frequent the bars down on M Street?" "No. Not at all. Not that I know of. No, I thought not. I made a little check. And so he wouldn't have had a reason to be at the top of those steps beside your house after leaving here that night. And was it also not his custom to travel by taxi? He wouldn't call a cab from your house when he left." "Yes, he would. At least, he always did." Then one wonders, not so? Why or how he came to be there that night. And one wonders why taxicab companies do not show a record of calls from this house on that night, except for the one that picked up your Miss Spencer here at precisely 6:47. Her voice drained of color. Chris said softly, "I don't know." "No, I doubted that you would," the detective told her. "In the meantime, the matter has now grown somewhat serious." Chris was breathing shallowly. "In what way?" "The report of the pathologist," Kinderman recounted, "seems to show that the chance that Dennings died accidentally is still very possible. However, are you saying he was murdered?" "Well, it seems that the position." Kinderman hesitated. "I'm sorry," he said, "this will be painful." "Go ahead." "The position of Dennings's head and a certain shearing of the muscles of the neck would." Shutting her eyes, Chris winced and said, "Oh, God. Yes, as I said, it's very painful. I'm so sorry. Really. But you see, this condition. I think we can skip the details. Perhaps it never could happen unless Mr. Dennings had fallen some distance before he hit the steps. For example, maybe 20, 30 feet before he went rolling down to the bottom. So a clear possibility, plainly speaking, is that maybe." Kinderman turned to Sharon. Arms folded across her chest, she had been listening, mesmerized and wide-eyed. "Well, now, first let me ask you something, Miss Spencer. When you left, he was where, Mr. Dennings? With the child?" "No. He was down here in the study fixing a drink." "Might your daughter remember," he turned to Chris, "if perhaps Mr. Dennings was in her room that night?" "Why do you ask? Might your daughter remember?" "How could she? Like I told you, she was heavily sedated and—" Yes, you did tell me." "That's true. I recall it. But perhaps she awakened." "No, she didn't," Chris told him. "She was also sedated when last we spoke?" "Yes, she was. I thought I saw her at her window that day." "Well, you're mistaken." "It could be." "Perhaps so. I'm not sure." "Listen, why are you asking all this?" "Well, a clear possibility, as I was saying, is maybe the deceased was so drunk that he stumbled and fell from the window in your daughter's bedroom." "Not so?" "No way. In the first place, that window was always closed, and besides, Burke was always drunk, but he never got sloppy. Burke used to direct when he was drunk. Now how could he stumble and fall out a window? Were you maybe expecting someone else here that night?" "Someone else? No, I wasn't." "Have you friends who drop by without calling?" "Only Burke." The detective lowered his head and shook it. "So strange," he breathed out wearily. "Baffling." Then he lifted his glance to Chris. "The deceased comes to visit, stays only 20 minutes without even seeing you, and leaves all alone here a very sick girl?" And speaking plainly, as you yourself say, it's not likely he would fall from a window. Besides, a fall wouldn't do to his neck what we found except maybe a chance in 100, in 1,000. He motioned with his head at the witchcraft book. You've read in that book about ritual murder? Her chill prescience mounting, Chris quietly said, no. Maybe not in that book, said Kinderman. However, forgive me, I mention this only so maybe you'll think just a little bit harder. Poor Mr. Dennings was discovered with his neck wrenched around in the style of ritual murder by so-called demons, Mrs. MacNeil. Chris's complexion visibly paled. Some lunatic killed Mr. Dennings and Kinderman halted. Something wrong? He asked. He had noticed a tension in her eyes, her sudden pallor. No, nothing's wrong. Go ahead. I'm obliged. Now at first, I never told you, to spare you the hurt. And besides, it could technically still be an accident. But me, I don't think so. My hunch? My opinion? I believe he was killed by a powerful man, point 1, and the fracturing of his skull, point 2, plus the various things I have mentioned would make it very probable, not certain, your director was killed and then afterward pushed from your daughter's window. But no one was here except your daughter. So then how could this be? Well, it could be one way. If someone came calling between the time Miss Spencer left and the time you returned. Not so? Now I ask you again, please, who might have come? Chris lowered her head. Judas Priest, just a second. Yes, I'm sorry. It's painful. And perhaps I'm all wrong. But you'll think now? Who might have come, please? Head still lowered, Chris frowned in thought for a time, then looked up. No, I'm sorry. There's just no one I can think of. Kinderman turned his glance to Sharon. Maybe you then, Miss Spencer. Someone comes here to see you. Oh, no, no one. Does the horseman know where you work? Chris asked her. Kinderman's eyebrows rose. The horseman? Sharon's boyfriend, Chris explained. Sharon shook her head. He's never come here, she said. And besides, he was in Boston that night at some convention. He's a salesman? Asked Kinderman. A lawyer. Ah. The detective turned back to Chris. The servants? They have visitors? He asked. No, never. Not at all. You expected a package that day? Some delivery? Why? Mr. Dennings was, not to speak ill of the dead, but as you said, in his cups he was somewhat, well, let's call it irascible, and capable, doubtless, of provoking an argument or an anger, and in this case maybe even a rage from perhaps a delivery person who'd come by with a package. So were you expecting something? Dry cleaning, maybe? Groceries? Liquor? A package? I wouldn't know. Carl handles all of that. Ah, of course. Want to ask him? Go ahead. The detective sighed morosely. Leaning back from the table, he stuffed his hands into the pockets of his coat as he cast a glum look at the witchcraft book. Never mind, it's remote. You've got a daughter very sick, and, well, enough now. He made a gesture of dismissal. That's it. End of meeting. He stood up. Thank you for your time, he said to Chris, and then to Sharon. Very nice to have met you, Miss Spencer. Same here, Sharon answered remotely. She was staring into space. Baffling, said Kinderman with a headshake. So strange, so very strange. He was focused on some inner thought. Then he looked at Chris as she rose from her chair. Well, I'm sorry. I've bothered you for nothing, he said. Here, I'll walk you to the door, Chris told him. Both her expression and her voice were subdued. Oh, please don't bother. It's no bother at all. If you insist. Oh, incidentally, the detective said as he and Chris were moving out of the kitchen, just a chance in a million, I know, but your daughter, you could ask her if she possibly saw Mr. Dennings in her room that night. Look, he wouldn't have had a reason to be up there in the first place. Yes, I know that. I realize that's true, but if certain British doctors never asked, what's this fungus? We wouldn't today have penicillin. Am I right? Please ask. You'll ask? When she's well enough, yes, I'll ask. Couldn't hurt. They had arrived at the home's front door. In the meantime, the detective continued. But he faltered, and, touching two fingertips to his lips, he said gravely, Look, I hate to be asking you this. Please forgive me. Expecting some new shock, Chris tensed and felt the prescience tingling again in her bloodstream. She said, What? For my daughter. You could maybe give an autograph. The detective's cheeks had reddened. After a moment of surprise, Chris almost laughed with relief, at herself and at despair and the human condition. "Oh, of course. Where's a pen?" "Right here," responded Kinderman instantly, whipping out a pen from the pocket of his coat while his other hand dipped into a pocket of his jacket and slipped out a calling card. He handed them to Chris. "She would love it." "What's her name?" Chris asked, pressing the card against the door as she held the pen poised to write. A weighty hesitation followed as from behind her she heard only wheezing. She glanced around, and in Kinderman's eyes and reddening face she saw the tension of some massive inner struggle. "I lied," he said finally, his eyes at once desperate and defiant. "The autograph's for me. Write, to William. William F. Kinderman. It's spelled on the back." Chris eyed him with a wan and unexpected affection, checked the spelling of his name and wrote, "William F. Kinderman, I love you. Chris MacNeil," and then gave him the card, which he tucked into his pocket without reading the inscription. "You're a very nice lady," he said to Chris sheepishly. "Thanks. You're a very nice man." He seemed to blush harder. "No, I'm not. I'm a bother." He was opening the door. "Never mind what I said here today. Forget it. Keep your mind on your daughter." "Your daughter?" Chris nodded, her despondency returning as Kinderman stepped out onto a wide and low, black iron-gated stoop. He turned around, and in the daylight was more conscious of the dark sacs beneath the movie star's eyes. He donned his hat. "But you'll ask her?" he reminded. "And I will," she said. "I promise." "Well, then goodbye. And take care."